In January of 1908, a farmer in South Dakota named Andrew Helgelian received a letter from a widow in Indiana. She wrote to him about her farm, about her loneliness, and about the life they might build together. She asked him to bring his savings, and she closed the letter with a single line that would become one of the most chilling sentences in American criminal history. "Come prepared to stay forever." Andrew Helgelian went to Indiana. He was never seen alive again. 4 months later, investigators would begin digging in the soft ground behind her farmhouse. What they pulled out of that Indiana soil horrified a nation and left behind a mystery that, more than a century later, has still never been solved. This is the story of Belle Gunness. She was not born Belle. She was born Brynhild Polsdatter Storseth on the 11th of November, 1859, in the municipality of Selbu in Norway. She came from a poor family in a hard country, and like hundreds of thousands of Scandinavians in that era, she looked west for something better. In 1881, she emigrated to the United States. When she was processed on arrival, her name was written down in the American style, and Brynhild became Belle. She was 21 years old. For a time, her life looked entirely ordinary. In 1884, she married a fellow Norwegian immigrant named Mads Sorensen. They settled in Chicago. They took in children. By every outward appearance, they were an unremarkable immigrant family working to build a life. Then on the 30th of July, 1900, Mads Sorensen died. The stated cause was a cerebral hemorrhage, and on the surface, there was nothing obviously suspicious about a man dying suddenly of a stroke. But there was a detail that would only look strange much later, when people knew what to look for. Mads Sorensen had 2 life insurance policies, and the day he died was the single day on which both of those policies were simultaneously active. One was expiring, the other was just beginning. His death fell precisely in the overlap. Belle collected $5,000. In 1900, that was an enormous sum, the equivalent of many years of a working man's wages. No one investigated. There was no autopsy. Belle took the money, and she used it to buy a farm on the outskirts of LaPorte, Indiana. A quiet property on a quiet road, well outside of town. On the 1st of April, 1902, she married again. Her second husband was a butcher named Peter Gunness. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a decent and hardworking man. He gave her the surname that history would remember. 8 months later, Peter Gunness was dead. Belle's explanation was that a meat grinder had fallen from a high shelf and struck him on the head. It was an unlikely story. The injury was a severe skull fracture. There were people in LaPorte who did not believe a word of it, and there was talk, briefly, of an inquest. But talk was all it amounted to. No charges were ever brought. Belle collected $3,000 in insurance. Now she was a widow twice over, alone on a farm outside a small Indiana town, with money in the bank and no husband to answer to. And it was at this point that the pattern changed from something that might be explained away as terrible luck into something deliberate, methodical, and sustained. Beginning around 1905, Belle Gunness started placing advertisements in newspapers. She placed them in Chicago papers and in Norwegian-language newspapers that circulated among Scandinavian immigrant communities across the Midwest. The advertisements were matrimonial notices. A comfortable widow, they said, owner of a fine farm, seeking a reliable partner, a man of means, someone serious. And critically, the correspondence that followed always arrived at the same destination. Any man who was interested was told to come to the farm in LaPorte, and he was told to bring his money. The men came. Henry Gerhold, a farmhand from Wisconsin, came to the Gunness farm. He was never seen again. His trunk stayed behind on the property. John Moe from Minnesota came to the farm after withdrawing his cash. He was never seen again either. His trunk, too, remained. There were others. Men who told their families they were going to Indiana to meet a widow, who withdrew their savings, who boarded trains, and who simply stopped existing. Some were reported missing, some were not. In an era of mass immigration, where men moved constantly for work and correspondence was slow, a bachelor who stopped writing home was not necessarily a scandal. He might just have moved on. That was the terrible efficiency of it. Belle Gunness had found a category of victim that the world was prepared to lose track of. And then came Andrew Helgelian. Helgalian was a bachelor farmer from Aberdeen, South Dakota. He began exchanging letters with Belle in December of 1907. The correspondence intensified. In January of 1908, he received a letter urging him to come, to bring his money, and to be prepared to stay forever. He withdrew a substantial sum from his bank. He traveled to La Porte, and then, like the others, he vanished. But Andrew Helgalian had something the others did not. He had a brother. Assel Helgalian did not accept his brother's silence. He wrote to Belle asking where Andrew was. Belle wrote back with explanations, then with excuses, then with suggestions that Andrew had gone off to Norway or to Chicago. Assel did not believe her. He kept writing. He announced that he intended to come to Indiana himself and look for his brother. And it was at that point, with a determined man promising to arrive and start asking questions, that events on the Gunness farm accelerated toward their conclusion. In the early hours of the 28th of April, 1908, the Gunness farmhouse burned to the ground. When the fire was out and the wreckage cooled, searchers went into the cellar. There they found 4 bodies. 3 of them were children, Myrtle and Lucy Sorensen, 11 and 9 years old, and Philip Gunness, 5. The 4th body was an adult woman, and she had no head. The head was never found. It was never explained. Suspicion fell immediately on a man named Ray Lamphere. Lamphere was Belle's hired hand, and by most accounts her on and off lover. He had been dismissed from the farm, there had been friction between them, and he was arrested and charged in connection with the fire. But by then, Assel Helgalian had arrived in La Porte, and he wanted to know what had happened to his brother. Al, together with a farmhand named Joe Maxon, began to examine the ground around the property. Their attention was drawn to a series of soft depressions in the earth, places where the soil had been disturbed and had settled. They started to dig. What they found first was Andrew Helgalian. His remains were in a gunny sack, buried in the yard. And what had been done to the body was methodical in a way that told investigators something important. The remains had been dismembered with deliberate care, decapitated. The arms removed at the shoulders, the legs severed at the knees. This was not the work of panic, it was the work of routine. And once they knew what the soft depressions meant, they kept digging. They uncovered the partial remains of at least 11 more people. Bodies and parts of bodies in sacks and shallow graves spread across the property, men and at least 1 young woman. Some were identified, many were not and never would be. The excavation went on for days and the newspapers of America seized on it completely. Reporters descended on La Porte. Crowds came by the hundreds to stand at the fence and watch men dig bodies out of a farmyard. The property acquired the name it has carried ever since, the Murder Farm. The final number has never been settled. Investigators confirm remains of at least 11 to 14 individuals. Estimates of the true total, based on the missing men, the abandoned trunks, and the unaccounted correspondence, have run as high as 40. The honest answer is that nobody knows, because the digging stopped before the ground did. Ray Lamphere was brought to trial. He was acquitted of murder and convicted of arson in November of 1908. He died in prison the following year, but before he died, Lamphere talked. He said that Belle had placed the advertisements deliberately to lure men to the farm in order to rob and kill them. He described his own role in the aftermath, and he made one further claim, the claim that turned an already appalling case into an enduring mystery. He said that Belle Gunness did not die in that fire, and here the evidence becomes genuinely strange. 3 gold rings were recovered from the hand of the headless corpse, one of them associated with her first husband. That pointed toward the body being Belle. Her dentist examined a gold dental crown recovered from the debris and identified it as his own work, which pointed the same direction. But on the 9th of May, Dr. Harry Long, a physician who had known Belle Gunness personally, examined the remains and stated plainly that it was not her. His reasoning was physical, and it was difficult to dismiss. Belle Gunness was a very large woman, reported at well over 300 pounds. The corpse in the cellar weighed roughly 160. It was shorter than Belle had been, and its hands showed manicured nails, which did not match a woman who worked a farm and butchered livestock. So the body was identified by jewelry and a tooth, and contradicted by the body itself. Lampier's account offered an explanation that fit uncomfortably well. He claimed the corpse had been chosen, that it was another victim placed in the house, dressed with Belle's rings, left behind to be mistaken for her, while the woman herself walked away. If that is true, then the missing head was not a mystery at all. It was a solution. There is no more effective way to prevent a body from being identified by the people who knew the face. Belle Gunness was officially pronounced dead, but the reported sightings began almost immediately, and they continued for years. She was seen in Chicago. She was seen elsewhere. None of it was ever confirmed. In 2008, a century after the fire, researchers exhumed the headless corpse and attempted DNA analysis, hoping finally to answer the question. The samples had degraded too far. The results were inconclusive, and so it remains. What we know for certain is this: a woman came from Norway with nothing, collected insurance on 2 dead husbands, advertised for lonely men with savings, and buried at least a dozen human beings in her yard. What we do not know is whether she died in the fire she is presumed to have set, or whether she stood somewhere in a crowd, watching her own farm burn, and then simply walked into the rest of her life. The men who answered her advertisements were not careless. They were hopeful. They were immigrants and bachelors and widowers, working hard in a difficult country. And they read a letter from a woman who said she had a farm and a home and room for someone. Andrew Helgelian kept his letter. It was that letter and the brother who refused to stop asking questions that finally opened the ground at La Porte. Come prepared to stay forever. She meant it exactly as she wrote it.